This is my story. It is not a story of grand battles or heroic deeds, but of the quiet war fought within the walls of a home, a war of attrition against a man's soul. It is the story of how a glass of water, thrown in my face, washed away a lifetime of love and revealed a desert of contempt. And it is the story of what I did when I finally realized the oasis I had built for my son was a mirage, and that I was the only one dying of thirst. You see, they thought my silence was weakness. They were wrong. It was the calm before the storm, the drawing of a deep, final breath before plunging into the cold, cleansing waters of retribution. It happened at the dinner table, the very table I had bought for their wedding, a solid oak thing I had believed would be the anchor of a happy family. My son, Daniel, sat at its head, a king on a throne I had paid for. His wife, Clara, sat to his right, her smile a thin, sharp line. My grandchildren, bless their hearts, were just children, but they were learning their lessons well, their eyes already mirroring the casual disdain of their parents. The meal was roast chicken, a simple luxury. I had been feeling my age, a weariness deep in my bones that had nothing to do with labor and everything to do with a slowly breaking heart. I had finished my small portion, and my stomach still felt hollow. "Daniel," I said, my voice quiet, almost apologetic. It had become my default tone in that house, the voice of someone asking for a privilege, not claiming a right. "Could I trouble you for another piece of the chicken?" Just a small 1 inch, I gestured toward the platter, still laden with food. It was a simple request. A father asking his son for a little more of the food his own money had bought. A man asking for sustenance in the home he had provided. I thought it was a simple request. Daniel stopped chewing. He looked at me, not as a son looks at a father, but as a man looks at a stray dog that has wandered into his yard. There was no warmth, no recognition of our shared blood. There was only irritation, a profound and weary annoyance that I, this relic of his past, had dared to speak, had dared to want something. He picked up his glass of water, the crystal heavy and ornate, part of set I had given them as a housewarming gift. For a moment, I thought he was going to take a drink to ignore me, which was his usual method. That would have hurt, but it would have been a familiar wound. Instead, he leaned forward, his arm moving in a short, sharp arc. The water, shockingly cold, hit my face with a splash that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the room. It dripped from my chin, soaked the collar of my shirt, and ran in cold rivulets down my chest. My hair, thin and white, was plastered to my scalp. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water onto the polished oak table. It was the sound of my life, my sacrifices, my love, all pooling into a meaningless puddle. Then a snort. It came from Clara. She tried to hide it behind her hand, but her shoulders shook with suppressed laughter. Daniel didn't even bother to hide his. A cruel smirk played on his lips. "Thirsty, old man?" he asked, his voice dripping with a mockery so profound it was almost surreal. "There, I help you." My grandchildren stared, their eyes wide, not with horror, but with a kind of morbid curiosity, as if watching a particularly interesting television show. They were learning. They were learning that Grandpa was nothing, that he was a joke. I did not move. I did not wipe the water from my face. I did not speak. I simply sat there, feeling the cold seep into my skin, but a different kind of cold was spreading through my veins. It was the crystalline cold of absolute certainty. The love I had held for him, a vast and resilient ocean, had just frozen solid. In that moment, the man I had raised, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose fears I had soothed, whose dreams I had funded, ceased to exist. In his place sat a stranger, an enemy. And in my own heart, the long-suffering father died. Someone else was born in his place, someone colder, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. I looked at him, the water still dripping from my jaw, and I felt nothing but a profound and final resolve. This was the end. I had spent my life building. It began in hardship, a childhood defined by what was absent. I remembered the gnawing ache of a half-empty stomach, the worn thin soles of my only pair of shoes, the constant, low-level hum of anxiety that came with knowing there was never enough. My own father was a good man, but a broken one, worn down by a world that took more than it gave. He gave me what he could, which was a sense of duty and the knowledge of how to work until your hands bled. I promised myself, from an age so young I barely understood what a promise was, that my own child would never know that kind of lack. When Daniel was born, that promise became my religion. I held his tiny, perfect form in my arms, and I made a vow, not to God but to him. "You will have everything," I whispered to his sleeping face. "Everything I never had. You will never be hungry. You will never be cold. You will never be afraid." It was a promise I would spend the next 40 years keeping, a vow that became the central pillar of my existence. Every decision, every sacrifice was made with his future comfort and security in mind. I thought this was what a father did. I thought this was the purest expression of love. The sacrifices began small, almost unnoticeable. When Daniel needed a new school uniform, a crisp white shirt, and perfectly creased trousers that cost more than my weekly food budget, I simply ate less. For 2 weeks, my lunches were bread and water, my dinners a thin soup. I told myself it was a diet, a way to stay healthy. But I remember the dull ache in my belly as I watched him walk out the door, proud and clean in his new clothes, oblivious to the cost. I felt a pang of pride that was stronger than the pang of hunger. I thought that was love. When he was a teenager and wanted a bicycle, not just any bicycle, but a specific gleaming 10-speed model that all the popular boys had, I looked at my own meager possessions. I had one thing of value, a gold watch my father had given me on his deathbed. It was my only connection to him, a tangible piece of my own history. I wore it every day. Its weight on my wrist was a comfort, a reminder. I took it to a pawn shop. The man behind the counter gave me a fraction of what it was worth, his eyes indifferent. I walked out with the cash in my pocket and a strange lightness on my wrist that felt like a betrayal of my own past. But when I saw Daniel's face light up as he saw the bicycle, the way he rode it down the street with a whoop of pure joy, the empty space on my wrist seemed a small price to pay. I thought that made the sacrifice worthwhile. The sacrifices grew with him. When he turned 18, he needed a car. It wasn't a matter of life or death. Public transport was adequate, but it was a matter of status, of freedom, of fitting in. I had a small savings account, a rainy day fund I had been building for decades, coin by coin, dollar by dollar. It was my security, the small cushion against the uncertainties of old age. I depleted it. I drained the entire account to buy him a reliable used car. I remember signing the papers at the dealership, the salesman's slick smile, the feeling of my safety net vanishing. I handed the keys to Daniel, and he gave me a quick, distracted hug before speeding off with his friends. I stood on the curb, watching the taillights disappear, and felt a tremor of something I couldn't name. It felt like fear, but I pushed it down. This was for him. This was my purpose. His wedding to Clara was an extravagant affair, far beyond what they could afford. Clara came from a family that valued appearances above all else, and she wanted a fairy tale wedding. I saw the stress on Daniel's face as the cost mounted. He didn't ask me for help directly. He didn't have to. He just sighed heavily, leaving brochures for venues and caterers on the kitchen table, mentioning in passing how impossible it all was. So I took out a second mortgage on my small, fully paid-for house. The house I had worked my entire life to own outright. The house I had imagined living in peacefully until my final days. The bank manager explained the risks, the new monthly payments, the danger of losing my home if I defaulted. I signed the papers anyway. The wedding was beautiful. The pictures were stunning. Daniel and Clara looked happy. I thought that was all that mattered. The final and most significant sacrifice was the down payment on their house. They wanted to live in a wealthy suburb, in a large house with a garden for the children they plan to have. They had good jobs, but not good enough to afford the life they felt they deserved. By then, I was nearing retirement. My pension was modest, but combined with my Social Security, it would have been enough for a simple, dignified life. I also had a retirement investment account, the last bastion of my financial planning. I liquidated it, all of it. I gave them a cashier's check for a sum so large it made my hand tremble to write it. It was everything I had left. When I handed the check to Daniel, he took it with a casualness that stunned me. "Thanks, Dad," he said, tucking it into his pocket as if it were a grocery receipt. "This will really help." There was no grand speech of gratitude, no acknowledgement of the magnitude of the gift. It was simply expected. It was my duty. I had given him my past when I sold my father's watch. I had given him my future when I emptied my retirement account. I had given him my present security when I remortgaged my home. I had given him everything. My fatal assumption, the mistake that would lead to that final, humiliating dinner, was rooted in that love. To make things simpler, as Daniel had put it, we had structured our finances in a particular way. After his mother passed, I was lonely. He suggested I sell my house, the one I had just mortgaged for his wedding, and move in with him and Clara. He said it would be easier for them to look after me in my old age. The proceeds from the sale, a substantial amount, went into a joint savings account. "For emergencies, Dad," he had said reassuringly. "And it makes it easier for me to manage your bills." My pension and Social Security checks were deposited directly into that same account. The house they lived in, the one I had provided the down payment for, was legally in my name. I was the sole owner on the deed. It was a tax strategy. Daniel's accountant had explained something about gift taxes and inheritance. It made sense at the time. I was the financial bedrock, the legal owner of everything, but I had handed him the keys. I had given him the checkbook, the debit card, the online banking password. I had given him total practical control. I did it because I trusted him. I believed with every fiber of my being that a son for whom I had sacrificed everything would, in turn, care for me with love and respect. I thought that by making myself completely dependent on his goodwill, I was demonstrating the ultimate faith. I thought my reward for a lifetime of providing would be a peaceful old age, surrounded by a loving family who cherished me. I thought that was how the world worked. It was the most devastatingly wrong assumption of my entire life. The disrespect did not begin overnight. It was a slow creep, like a vine strangling a tree, so gradually you don't notice until the leaves start to yellow. At first, it was small things, easily dismissed. When I'd start to tell a story from my past, a memory I treasured, his eyes would glaze over. He'd pick up his phone, his thumbs scrolling endlessly, his attention a million miles away. Or he'd cut me off mid-sentence. "Yeah, Dad, you've told me that one before." His tone wasn't cruel. Not yet. It was just dismissive, as if my life, my experiences, were a collection of boring, repeated anecdotes not worth his time. I would fall silent, a little wounded, but I'd tell myself he was busy, stressed from work. I made excuses for him. Then came the lack of eye contact. I would speak to him, and he would answer while looking at the television, or at his computer, or at his wife. It made me feel invisible, like a ghost in my own home, or rather, his home that I had paid for. The short answers became his norm. "How was your day, son?" I'd ask, genuinely interested. "Fine," he'd reply, the word a door slamming shut. There were no follow-up questions, no interest in my own day. My existence had been reduced to a piece of furniture that occasionally spoke. I felt the distance between us growing, a chasm opening up where once there had been a bridge built of love and shared experience. The disrespect soon became more overt, graduating from passive dismissal to active disdain. It often centered on my physical presence. When I needed help with something simple, like opening a stubborn jar or reading the fine print on a medicine bottle, he would let out a loud, theatrical sigh. It was a sound of profound burden, as if my small request was the final straw on the back of a man carrying the weight of the world. "What now?" he'd snap, his voice edged with impatience. I started to hesitate before asking for anything, weighing my need against the inevitable wave of his annoyance. More often than not, I chose to struggle in silence. His wife, Clara, was a quiet accomplice in this erosion of my dignity. She never confronted me directly. Her method was more insidious. If I was slow to get up from a chair, she would exchange a look with Daniel, a small, knowing smirk. If I spilled a little tea, her lips would tighten, and she would clean it with a brisk, angry efficiency that screamed her disapproval. She started referring to me not by name, but as your father when speaking to Daniel, always with a tone that implied I was a problem to be managed. "Your father left his newspaper on the coffee table again," she'd say, as if I'd committed a cardinal sin. She was the echo to his voice, amplifying his contempt in a quieter, but no less damaging key. Then my grandchildren began to learn the tune. Children are sponges, and they were soaking up the atmosphere of disrespect. My grandson, only 8 years old, started mimicking his father's size. When I'd ask him to pass the salt, he'd let out a little huff, a perfect imitation. My granddaughter, a bit older, began to mock my slowness. "Come on, Grandpa, hurry up," she'd whine, rolling her eyes in a way that was a carbon copy of her mother's. One afternoon, I was telling them a story about the war, something I thought would be interesting, and she interrupted me. "Bow ring," she said, and turned back to her tablet. Daniel, who was sitting right there, just chuckled. He didn't correct her. He didn't defend me. He validated her disrespect. In that moment, I saw the generational transfer of contempt. The poison was being passed down. The most galling part was the weaponization of finances. All the money, the house, the savings, my pension was mine. It was a fact, a legal reality. Yet Daniel cultivated a narrative, both within the home and to the outside world, that he was the sole provider, generously supporting his aging father. He complained constantly about expenses. "Do you know how much the electric bill was this month?" he'd announce at the dinner table, looking directly at me, as if my reading lamp were single-handedly bankrupting him. "The price of groceries is just insane," he'd mutter after I'd had a second helping of potatoes. It was a masterful performance of a beleaguered son burdened by a dependent parent. He made me feel like a freeloader, a beggar living on his charity. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. My pension, my social security, the life savings I had poured into his world, all of it was consumed by the household. And yet he acted as if every bite of food I ate was a gift from his own pocket. He created a fiction where he was the benefactor and I was the beneficiary. And he played the part with such conviction that I sometimes began to doubt my own reality. The gas I used when he allowed me to borrow the car I had helped buy, became a point of contention. "You went all the way to the library?" "Dad, gas doesn't grow on trees." He made me feel guilty for existing, for taking up space, for having the smallest needs. Publicly, it was a different story. To his friends, to our extended family, he was the model son. "Of course we took my dad in," he'd say, his voice full of false sincerity. "It's the least a son can do. He's no trouble at all." He would put his arm around my shoulder at family gatherings, a proprietary gesture that was more about ownership than affection. He was performing the role of the dutiful child, and the world applauded him for it. They saw a successful man caring for his elderly father, and they commended his character. They didn't see the private mockery. They didn't hear the sighs, the complaints, the constant chipping erosion of my dignity. They didn't see the way his eyes went cold the moment the audience was gone. I endured it all in silence. I chose to absorb the humiliation because I believed it was the only way to keep the family together. What was the alternative? To argue? To protest? That would create conflict, tension. It would upset the grandchildren. It would confirm in Clara's eyes that I was a problem. I was terrified of being seen as a burden, so I allowed myself to become one. I thought my patience was a virtue, a form of love. I thought that by absorbing the pain, I was preserving the peace. I didn't realize I wasn't preserving peace. I was simply surrendering, day by day, piece by piece. The silence I maintained to avoid shame in public became a prison in private. I was complicit in my own erasure. The ordinary setting of that final dinner was what made the cruelty so stark. It wasn't a heated argument that had been brewing for hours. It was a calm Tuesday evening. The day had been like any other. I had woken up, read my book, taken a slow walk around the block, and sat quietly in the living room, trying to stay out of the way. There was no prelude to the storm. The sky was clear until the moment the lightning struck. The mundanity of the scene, the clink of cutlery, the low hum of the refrigerator, the bland conversation about someone's promotion at Daniel's office, was the backdrop for an act of profound violence. Not physical violence that breaks bones, but a psychological violence that shatters a soul. My request was so small, so fundamentally reasonable. I was hungry. The portion of chicken on my plate had been meager, a child serving. I saw the platter still piled high. There was more than enough. In a normal family, such a request would be met with an immediate, "Of course, help yourself." It would not even be a question. It was a basic tenet of hospitality, of family, of simple human decency. To feed those at your table, especially to feed your own father. I asked quietly, deferentially, already conditioned to expect a negative response, but hoping for a flicker of the sun I once knew. "Could I trouble you for another piece of the chicken?" The words felt heavy in my mouth, the plea of a supplicant. Daniel's reaction was not just a denial. It was a statement. It was a performance. Picking up that heavy crystal glass was a deliberate act. The water sloshed, catching the light from the chandelier overhead, the chandelier I had installed for them. His movement was not born of anger in the way a man lashes out in a rage. It was colder than that. It was the calculated movement of someone asserting dominance, someone putting an animal in its place. The act of aggression was designed for maximum humiliation. To throw food would have been messy, angry. To throw water was a different kind of insult. It was a cleansing, a washing away of an unwanted presence. It was what you do to a dirty thing. It was contempt made liquid. The splash was a sound that bifurcated my life into a before and an after. Before, I was a father who was losing his son's respect. After, I was a man who had no son. The cold shock of the water was secondary to the cold shock of the realization. This person, this man I had created, held me in such low esteem that he could, in front of his wife and children, douse me with water for the crime of being hungry. He felt no shame. He felt no remorse. He felt, as his smirk confirmed, a sense of satisfaction. He had put the old man in his place. The reaction of the onlookers was the final nail in the coffin of my old life. It was the confirmation that I was utterly alone. Claire's chuckle was not a nervous tick. It was genuine amusement. She found my humiliation funny. She was his audience, and my degradation was her entertainment. Her laughter was the sound of her allegiance. She was with him, against me. There was no family unit here. There was a gang of two, and I was their target. Her complicity was, in some ways, even more painful than Daniel's act. He was cruel, but she was a witness who applauded the cruelty. And the children, my grandchildren, they just stared. Their faces were blank slates, but the lesson was being inscribed upon them in indelible ink. Grandpa can be treated this way. It is acceptable. It is even, judging by their mother's laughter, funny. They were not horrified. They were not confused. They were being educated in the family's true values. Respect was for the strong. Contempt was for the weak. I saw my legacy not in the wealth I had provided, but in the callousness I had inadvertently funded. I was not just losing my own dignity. I was witnessing the moral corruption of the next generation, a corruption financed by my own sacrifice. My silence in that moment was not weakness. It was not shock. It was the silence of a judge passing a sentence. As the water dripped from my face onto the oak table, a profound and terrible clarity descended upon me. Every excuse I'd ever made for him, every justification for his behavior, every hope that he would one day change, it all evaporated. I saw him for exactly what he was, a parasite who had mistaken his host for a servant, a hollow man propped up by my money and my love, who had grown to despise the very stilts that held him upright. In that silence, I was not the victim. I was the arbiter. The jury in my mind had reached a unanimous verdict. There would be no appeal. The father in me was dead, and the man who remained was about to become a ghost. I stood up from the table, my movements slow and deliberate. No one spoke. I think they expected me to shout, to weep, to finally break. My lack of reaction seemed to unnerve them more than any outburst could have. I turned my back on them, on the half-eaten meal, on the puddle of water on the table, and I walked out of the room. I did not look back. I felt their eyes on my wet shirt, but I did not care. I walked up the stairs to my room, each step a steady, measured beat, like a drum marking the beginning of a march. I closed my bedroom door and locked it. The click of the lock was a satisfying, final sound. I walked to the small mirror over my dresser, and looked at myself. An old man stared back, his face wet, his white hair plastered to his skull, his shirt stained and clinging to his chest. I saw the tremor in my hands, the deep, weary lines around my eyes. For a moment, a wave of immense sorrow washed over me. The grief for the son I had lost, for the love that had curdled into poison, was immense. It was a physical pain, a hollowness in my chest so vast I thought I might collapse into it. I had given my entire life, and this was my return. Humiliation, contempt, a glass of water in the face. But then something shifted. As I continued to stare at that pathetic, dripping reflection, the sorrow began to recede. It was replaced by something else, something I had not felt in decades. It was rage, not a hot, shouting rage, but a cold, silent fury. It was the rage of a man who has been pushed too far, who has absorbed insult after insult until his capacity for patience is utterly exhausted. It was the righteous anger of the deeply wronged. The patience I had mistaken for love had been seen as weakness. The silence I had maintained for peace had been interpreted as surrender. I had been a fool, a loving, trusting, patient fool, and my foolishness was over. The shift from pain to resolve was as sudden and absolute as a switch being flipped. The shaking in my hands stopped. The grief in my chest solidified into a block of ice. I realized, with a clarity that was almost terrifying, that this could not continue. But it would not end with a confrontation. It would not end with me shouting, demanding the respect I was owed. What would be the point? You cannot demand respect from someone who has none to give. You cannot appeal to the heart of a person who has demonstrated they do not have one. No, a scene would only give them more ammunition, another story to tell about the difficult old man. My response had to be as silent and as total as the contempt they had shown me. And then, like a ray of sunlight piercing through a storm cloud, I remembered. It came to me not as a complex thought, but as a simple, undeniable fact. The foundation of their entire life, the very ground beneath their feet, was not theirs. It was mine. The memory, long buried under the fiction of Daniel's success, rose to the surface. The house. The deed was in my name. My name alone. The sprawling 4-bedroom house in the exclusive suburb was legally, unequivocally mine. Daniel and Clara were, in the eyes of the law, tenants in my property. The forgotten truth didn't stop there. The bank accounts, the main savings account, the one that held the proceeds from the sale of my old house, the one into which my pension and Social Security were paid every month, was a joint account. But I was the primary account holder. I had set it up that way, a last subconscious act of self-preservation. Daniel had a card, and he had online access, but the ultimate authority rested with me. I could walk into that bank, and with my signature alone, I could empty it. The investments he dabbled in, the portfolio he boasted about at dinner parties, it was funded from that account. His entire financial world, his status, his wife's shopping habits, his children's private school fees, the lease on his fancy car, it was all an elaborate superstructure built on a foundation of my money, under my legal control. He had forgotten this. In his arrogance, in his long-held narrative of being the self-made man, he had completely forgotten who held the real power. He had grown so used to wielding the practical control that he had mistaken it for legal ownership. He saw the money as his, the house as his. He had forgotten that he was a king ruling a kingdom that belonged to another man, a man he had just humiliated beyond repair. The realization was not triumphant. It was cold. It was methodical. It was the discovery of a weapon, a tool of immense power that had been sitting in my hand the entire time. I had just never considered using it. Until now, a plan began to form in my mind, not in a rush of angry emotion, but with the cool precision of an architect designing a demolition. It would not be about confrontation. It would be about removal. I would not tear his world down in a fiery explosion of anger. I would simply, quietly, remove the foundations and walk away, letting the whole rotten structure collapse under its own weight. The plan was simple. It was total, and it involved my complete and utter disappearance. I would become a ghost in truth, not just in feeling. I took off my wet shirt, dropped it on the floor, and began to get ready. The time for sorrow was over. The time for action had begun. The next morning, I awoke before dawn. I had not slept. I had spent the night in the quiet dark, going over the plan, refining each step. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. The man who might have wavered, the father who might have reconsidered, was gone. I moved with a quiet purpose that was alien to the slow, careful movements of my recent years. I was no longer an old man shuffling toward the end of his life. I was an agent of consequence. My first move was made as soon as the sun was up. I found the bank's phone number online and called them the moment their lines opened at 8 o'clock. I spoke to a polite young woman, my voice calm and steady. I identified myself, provided my account numbers and security information, and confirmed my legal status as the primary, and in the case of the house deed, sole owner. I need to schedule an appointment with a personal banker for this afternoon, I said. It's a matter of some urgency. I'll be restructuring my assets. The woman was efficient. An appointment was made for 2 o'clock. The first gear of the machine had been engaged. I spent the morning maintaining a facade of normalcy. I went downstairs. The house was quiet. Daniel and Clara had already left for work, the children for school. They had left without a word to me, as usual. I made myself a cup of tea and a piece of toast, eating at the kitchen counter, avoiding the dining table. I did not want to look at the spot where I had been humiliated. I did not want to risk a flicker of the old sentimentality. I kept my mind focused, cold, and clear. I washed my cup and plate, wiped the counter, leaving no trace. A ghost leaves no mess. At 1:30, I called a taxi. I did not ask Daniel if I could borrow the car. I would never ask him for anything again. As I waited on the curb, I looked back at the large, impressive house. It looked like a monument to a life of folly. A monument I was about to decommission. The taxi arrived, and I gave the driver the address of the main branch of the bank downtown. The ride was quiet. I watched the city go by, feeling a profound sense of detachment, as if I were already a visitor from another country. The financial strike was executed with brutal, silent efficiency. I was shown into a quiet office where a man in a sharp suit named Mr. Harris greeted me. He pulled up my files. I saw the numbers on his screen, the large balance in the joint savings account. It was a sum that represented my entire life's work, the sale of my home, my liquidated retirement. A fortune. How can I help you, sir? He asked, his tone professional. I want to do 3 things, I said, my voice betraying no emotion. First, I want to close this joint savings account immediately. I want the entire balance transferred into a new account, in my name only. No joint holders, no one with debit access, no one with online privileges. Just me. Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow slightly, but made a note. Second, I want to cancel the debit card and all online access associated with my son, Daniel, on the old account, effective immediately. He nodded, typing. And third, I continued, I want to wire a significant portion of these funds to an offshore account. I have the details here. I pushed a piece of paper across the desk with the information for a bank in a small, quiet country known for its privacy laws. He looked at the numbers, at the instructions. He was a professional. He had probably seen family disputes before. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, at the scale and finality of it. Sir, this is a very substantial amount. The transfer will drain the account to almost nothing. Are you certain? He asked, a touch of due diligence in his voice. I have never been more certain of anything in my life, I replied. My tone left no room for argument. He saw the resolve in my eyes and turned back to his keyboard. For the next hour, I signed papers. I signed my name over and over again, each signature a quiet hammer blow, dismantling the financial house I had built for my ungrateful son. With each stroke of the pen, I felt lighter. I was cutting the chains. By the time I left the bank, Daniel's world had been financially hollowed out. He just didn't know it yet. His debit card was now a useless piece of plastic. His online banking portal, when he next logged in, would show him a balance of 0. He was a king without a kingdom, a peacock suddenly stripped of his feathers. The final preparations were made in secret. I returned to the house in another taxi. It was empty and silent. I went to my room and pulled a single old suitcase from the back of the closet. I did not pack much. A few changes of clothes, my reading glasses, the book I was halfway through, my passport, and the new bank documents. I packed the essentials of a man starting over, not the accumulated clutter of a man at the end of his life. I looked around the room, at the furniture, the photographs of my grandchildren. I felt nothing. They were artifacts from a different life, a museum of pain I was about to walk out of forever. While the house was still quiet, I sat at my small desk and made 2 online bookings. The first was a one-way, first-class plane ticket to a small coastal town in Portugal. Departing the next morning at 6 a.m., I had always wanted to see the ocean there. The second was a consultation with a law firm that specialized in property and estate law. I scheduled it for 3 weeks from now. I maintained my normal facade for one last evening. When the family returned, I was sitting in my usual chair in the living room, reading my book. No one spoke to me about the incident the night before. It was as if it had never happened. Daniel and Clara were cold and distant, but that was nothing new. They ignored me, and for the first time, I was grateful for it. We ate dinner in near total silence. I ate the small portion I was given without comment. I was no longer hungry. I was filled with a sense of purpose that was more nourishing than any food. That night, I did not go to bed. I waited, listening to the house fall asleep. I heard Daniel and Clara's television click off. I heard the floorboards creak as they settled into bed. I heard the silence deepen, until the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the steady beat of my own heart. At 3 a.m, when the world was at its darkest and most still, I stood up. I picked up my single suitcase. I did not write a note. A ghost does not leave a note. My absence would be my message. I walked down the stairs, my feet silent on the carpeted steps. I paused at the front door. I took one last look into the darkness of the house I owned, a house filled with strangers. There was no sadness, no regret. There was only a profound sense of liberation. I was breaking the final chain. I opened the door, stepped out into the cool, pre-dawn air, and closed it gently behind me. The click of the latch was the final word in a long and painful chapter of my life. I walked down the driveway, leaving the house and the life within it behind me, and I did not look back. I was walking toward the ocean, toward a new life, a life of quiet dignity. A life that was finally my own. The discovery, I imagine, would not have been immediate. The first cracks in Daniel's perfect world would have been small. Perhaps it was at lunch the next day. He would have taken a client to an expensive restaurant, eager to impress. He would have talked loudly, gestured grandly, the master of his universe. At the end of the meal, he would have handed the waiter his debit card with a confident flourish, and it would have been declined. I can picture the flicker of confusion on his face, followed by a flash of annoyance. He would assume it was a bank error, a problem with the restaurant's machine. He'd try it again. Declined. A touch of embarrassment would creep in. He would pull out a credit card, pay the bill, and make a mental note to call the bank later, his anger simmering at the inconvenience. He would not suspect the truth. The thought that his father, the quiet, pathetic old man, could be responsible would not even enter his mind. The real panic would have set in later that evening. At home, perhaps after another silent, tense dinner where he noticed my absence only as a lack of a target for his irritation, he would have finally sat down at his computer to check the accounts. He would log in, impatient, ready to see what technical glitch had caused his earlier embarrassment. And he would have seen it. Balance, $1,742. Or some other ridiculously small, residual amount. He would stare at the screen, disbelieving. He'd refresh the page. The number would remain. He'd check the transaction history. He would see it then, a single, massive transfer. Account closure. Funds moved. He would feel a surge of cold dread. This wasn't a glitch. This was an action. He'd frantically try to access the other investment portals, only to find his login credentials denied. He'd try to pay a bill online, and the payment would fail. The digital scaffolding of his life would be crumbling before his eyes. He would have called the bank then, his voice tight with a mixture of fury and fear. He would have demanded answers, and a calm, professional voice on the other end of the line would have informed him that the account had been closed by the primary holder, that he no longer had access, that the funds were gone. "But it's my money," he would have screamed into the phone. And the voice would have replied, coolly, "I'm sorry, sir, but according to our records, you were only a secondary user." The account belonged to your father. That is the moment the collapse of his arrogance would have begun. The moment the fiction he had built his life on collided with the brutal wall of reality. He wasn't the provider. He was the dependent. He wasn't the king. He was the court jester, and the true king had just left the castle and taken the entire treasury with him. He would have slammed down the phone, his face pale. He would have turned to Clara, his voice a strangled whisper. The money, it's gone. All of it. The search would have been next. A frantic, desperate hunt. He would have stormed up to my room, the room he had so grudgingly allowed me, and thrown open the door. He would have found it neat, quiet, and mostly empty. My suitcase gone. My personal effects gone. Just a few old paperbacks left on the shelf. He would have checked the closet, under the bed, his panic mounting. He would have yelled my name through the house, the sound echoing in the empty rooms. He was searching for the man he had despised, because he now realized that man was the source of everything he had. The silence that answered him would be the sound of his world ending. The realization would dawn, not slowly, but in a catastrophic crash. I was gone, and I had taken everything. His rage would have been immense, impotent. Rage at my audacity. Rage at his own stupidity. But underneath it all would be the cold, terrifying certainty of his own powerlessness. For 3 weeks, I let him stew in that powerlessness. I let him and Clara face the cascade of consequences. The bounced checks, the calls from the private school about overdue tuition, the warning letters from the luxury car dealership, the dawning horror that the house they lived in was not theirs, and that they could be evicted at any moment. I let their world shrink day by day until it was the size of their own, true, meager earnings. While they were panicking, I was breathing. For the first time in years, I was truly breathing. I had found a small, clean apartment in a little town on the Algarve coast. It overlooked the Atlantic, and the air was thick with the smell of salt and grilled sardines. My days were simple. I would wake up, walk down to the local cafe for coffee and a pastry, and then I would walk for miles along the beach, feeling the sun on my face and the sand under my feet. The water, the vast, endless ocean, was not a tool of humiliation here. It was a source of peace, its rhythmic crashing a soothing lullaby for a wounded soul. I ate when I was hungry, buying fresh fish and bread from the local market. I slept when I was tired. I spoke to people who smiled at me, who treated me with the simple, default kindness one affords a stranger. I was no longer a burden. I was just a man living his life. This was my justice, not a fiery revenge, but a quiet, peaceful freedom. After 3 weeks had passed, my lawyer in the city where they lived sent the message I had instructed him to. It wasn't a long, explanatory letter. It was a formal notice to vacate my property within 30 days. Tucked inside the legal envelope was a small, personal note. It was handwritten by me on a simple white card. I had thought about what to write for a long time. I had composed furious, rambling letters in my head, listing every sacrifice, every insult. But in the end, I knew that simplicity was the sharpest blade. The note contained only one sentence. You threw a glass of water in my face when I was thirsty, so I have drained the well from which you drink, that was all. It directly linked his act of petty, cruel dominance to my act of total, silent retribution. It offered no explanation, no apology, no room for negotiation. It was a statement of fact, an epitaph for our relationship. I knew he would understand. He would read it, and he would know, with absolute certainty, that this was not a rash act of anger. It was a considered judgment, a consequence he had earned. I have no idea what happened to them after that. I never checked. I never called. I instructed my lawyer to handle the sale of the house and forward the proceeds to my new address, and to not pass on any messages. Their fate is no longer my concern. Perhaps Daniel learned some humility. Perhaps he found a way to stand on his own 2 feet, to build a life, however modest, with his own hands. Perhaps he and Clara grew closer in their shared hardship, or perhaps their marriage, built on a foundation of money and status, crumbled along with their finances. It does not matter to me. They are ghosts from a past life, figures in a story that has ended. My new life is quiet. It is small. I have my apartment, my walks by the sea, my books, my simple meals. I have enough money to last me the rest of my days in comfort and dignity. I have not forgotten the pain. Some nights, I still feel the phantom cold of that water on my face. But it no longer has the power to wound me. It is just a memory, a scar that reminds me of a battle I survived. A battle I won not by fighting, but by walking away. My story is a cautionary tale, I suppose. A lesson on the nature of respect. It is not something that can be demanded, but it is also not something that can be endlessly denied without consequence. Daniel lost everything not because he was evil in a grand sense, but because he was careless with a sacred thing. He took for granted the love and sacrifice that built his world. He could not offer the smallest measure of kindness, the simplest gesture of respect, to the man who had given him everything. And so, in the end, he was left with nothing. He had a kingdom built on water, and he never understood that his father controlled the tide. And I have the ocean, and it is more than enough.